That's some freshly brewed coffee, I tell you what, boy. Alright, so I'm not gonna freight around the goddamn topic here. I'm pretty excited. I ain't gonna lie, I ain't no sinner. And I'll let you know why I'm so goddamn excited. It's because today, we're talking about this black piece of shit. That's right, I'm pulling out the Ralph Seppi shit. I'm talking about movies, but if there's one franchise in particular that gets me all whippity-boo like a goddamn kachoo, it's Godzilla. As a little bitch-ass kid who absolutely adored dinosaurs, whenever I found out of the existence of a tall Asian man in a rubber suit who could blow atomic breath, I was like, damn, I need to get in on that shit. And that's exactly what I did, and for a lot of my lifetime, Godzilla has just been this, like, essential component to my childhood and even to my adult life today. As a kid, I grew up with all 28 of the Japanese films from 1954 to 2004, and I just want to talk about that today. Although, I will note that I'm not really going to dive into the Showa period too much, just because there's a lot of fucking films I'd have to rewatch in order to talk about that. That's gonna be for a different video. Today, I'm just gonna be focusing on the two more preferred eras for me, Heisei period and Millennium. Now, in case you don't know what I'm talking about, Godzilla franchise is typically divided into 3 different eras, and I'm talking about before 2014 happened. I'm talking about, you know, classics here. You got your Showa period, which happened from 1954 to 1975. Then you got your Heisei period, which is my favorite period personally, which started from 1984 and into 1995. Then you got your Millennium period, which happened from 1999 to 2004. All of these periods are good in their own right, but as I previously said, my personal favorite is definitely the Heisei films, and I'm going to get into why that is in a second. But before we dive into the second era of Godzilla, we have to look into the first. I'm going to be talking about the very first Godzilla film, all the way back from '54. Now, despite this movie being a drastic change in tone from what Godzilla would later become within the Showa period, 1954 Godzilla is one of the most intriguing Japanese pieces of media ever, in my opinion. It's not only the birth of a cultural icon for the country, but its presence within the cinema industry is so culturally significant. The thing that's so captivating about the first Godzilla film is that it was one of the first instances of commentary in such a format over atomic bombs and how the Japanese perceive new technology. Now, this is important because this is what fuels the cultural divide between us Americans and the Japanese that would later also fuel the curiosity of anime in the early 2000s. You see, because the Japanese experienced being bombed firsthand, they didn't see technology in the same light that us Americans did, where technology was this new, wonderful thing that had yet to be explored, and, you know, it's very representative in our different approaches to sci-fi. On our corner, you have things like Star Trek, you have things like Star Wars that, you know, portray technology in a pretty positive or, you know, neutral light, you know. Nothing wrong there. But then on the Japanese side, you have films like Godzilla and Akira, which ends in end-of-the-world type shit. On top of just being culturally significant, the first Godzilla movie is also pretty impressive cinematically. They really went all out with this film. They did as much as possible to make sure that this was a fucking horror movie. They shot at low angles to make sure that this guy in a rubber suit didn't appear like a guy in a rubber suit, you know. Shooting at low angles makes it appear bigger, and therefore it looks like and feels like an actual threat. The effects might be outdated and the silhouettes might not look very good, which is something they would definitely improve on later, but even still, the whole movie revolves around Godzilla's presence, so even though it doesn't feel like Godzilla's really there just due to technological disadvantage of being made in the 50s, you can still feel his presence within the implications throughout the movie. It's a very interesting, intriguing film, and I highly recommend that if you're going to get anywhere with Godzilla, you have to not only watch this film, but you have to understand it from a historical standpoint. Now, of course, because us Americans are fucking retarded, you know, we didn't really want to reveal what all happened as an aftermath of the bombs yet, and this was a film that very heavily delved into the emotional tolls of the people who experienced the bombs firsthand. So, as a result, us Americans heavily censored the original Godzilla, and we redubbed it into a cut that's now typically known as Godzilla King of the Monsters, which is ironic because that's the name of the next American Godzilla movie coming out. It goes full fucking circle. Thankfully, however, because, you know, history favors the champion above the, you know, the bottom tier, Gojira is probably more heavily distributed in the States nowadays, which Gojira is the original Japanese cut of the film, and is definitely the one you want to see if you want to look into this film. You can watch the American cut, but it uses probably about 10 to 30% of the original movie, and it's heavily just doused in a fucking bucket of exposition. It's not good. And then the serious tone from the first movie was ruined immediately with the second. But while I'm not really gonna go into the specifics of the 14 movies that would follow, I will say that the first 4 movies of the Godzilla franchise established a very important rule. Actually, it established 3 rules. Number 1, Godzilla has to wreck shit. Number 2, Godzilla has to fight another monster. And number 3, there has to be some fantasy or sci-fi element to it. Now, not every great Godzilla movie has to follow this, but 95% of the time that a great Godzilla movie exists, they follow these guidelines. In fact, in every single Heisei movie, they follow these guidelines. At least a little bit. Maybe not Return of Godzilla, but we're gonna get into that in a second. Flash forward to 1975. Godzilla has been a cultural icon for years now, but the films have worn thin, and you can very clearly tell that by movies like Godzilla's Revenge or Son of Godzilla, which are typically regarded to be some of the worst Godzilla films out there. So it's no surprise that Toho decided to let up a little bit on the Godzilla, just wait it out a little bit. But then, suddenly, in 1984, something beautiful happens. Japan's like, you know what? We need more Godzilla. He's been arrested for 9 fucking years. Bring that nigga back up here. And they tasked the director Koji Hashimoto to direct The Return of Godzilla. While The Return of Godzilla isn't really regarded to be one of the best Godzilla films of either the Heisei period or the franchise as a whole, it's still a pretty damn good flick, and it still holds its own little flair of historical significance. You see, the 80s was the prime fucking time of American releases. We got films during the 80s like E.T., fucking Back to the Future, Gremlins. Not only were they important to the cinema industry, but they were blockbuster films, you know, and there was no other country at the time who were pumping out these films quite like us Americans were. Simply put, the Americans didn't really have any competition as far as the foreign film market went, because we were the ones putting out the biggest blockbusters, like, you know, Ghostbusters and shit like that. But in 1984, Japan decided, you know what, we're gonna enter back onto the scene and, you know, show that we can be just as good as America's biggest blockbusters with Return of Godzilla. Basically, while it didn't exactly create the competition that probably would have been expected between the markets, it showed off that other cinemas were just as capable as making technologically advanced blockbusters like America was. Unfortunately, Return of Godzilla didn't exactly make its money back, so, you know, yeah. Still, though, it's a great flick that I highly recommend if you're gonna check out Godzilla. It's one of those memorable ones. One of the biggest complaints I have with it is the distribution of the film in America. It's a similar story with 1954 Godzilla and 1984 Godzilla. Return of Godzilla was heavily re-edited back in the States to be released as Godzilla 1985. This is because the Return of Godzilla heavily relies on this, aspect of the Cold War, and America wasn't ready showing that to audiences, so they heavily censored it. But unlike Gojira 1954, the original Japanese cut, it's very hard to actually get your hands on the Japanese cut of Return of Godzilla, unless you probably buy it on Blu-ray or something. Following that up, in 1989, we got Godzilla vs. Biollante, which is another great one. Once again, not my favorite from the Heisei period, but it introduces one of my favorite villains of the Godzilla franchise. This is something that the Godzilla franchise would sorely miss for a long time, just because, once again, this sequel didn't really hit any strides at the box office, but it introduced a new villain, and this new enemy was actually very interesting. It's essentially like Audrey 2 buffed the fuck up. Biollante is one of my favorite villains. Not my favorite, but one of my favorites. He's just a villain that doesn't get enough appreciation. As a matter of fact, anyone who's seen this film probably agrees that it's harshly underrated in the Godzilla catalog. It's actually a very solid film that introduces a lot of interesting aspects. It plays a little bit more on the horror. The plot of the film itself is that they fuse Godzilla's DNA with a plant. I don't remember why the hell they did that, but it creates one of the greatest foes of all Godzilla time. And that's a big boy recommend for me. But nothing would come even close to the revelation that is Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. Now, to give you some context, King Ghidorah is the greatest foe that Godzilla has ever faced. He's the Joker to Batman. He's the fucking Green Goblin to Spider-Man. So when you introduce King Ghidorah as the third runner-up in this new series, you're basically asking for a fucking gold mine. They intentionally brought forth King Ghidorah in the second series so that they could make their money back, and holy shit, did it result in one of the biggest goddamn creature features of all fucking time. To put it into perspective, this film is the quintessential Godzilla film in the sense that Part 4 is the quintessential Friday the 13th movie. You just can't go wrong with it. This is also the film that went full-fledged all out with these previously set rules that I mentioned. Godzilla has to wreck shit. He wrecks the fuck out of shit. He has to fight another monster. Hey, find your greatest adversary. Hell yeah, sign me up. And there has to be some fantasy or sci-fi element. Well, in this movie, they experiment with time travel. Whenever you experiment with time travel alongside giant fucking monsters fighting in goddamn Japan, you're set for success, baby. You got my approval. So here's how the plot goes. Visitors from the 23rd century visit the 20th century to warn politicians that Godzilla in the future is going to destroy all of Japan entirely. In order to prevent this, they have to go back in time to destroy the dinosaur that was mutated into Godzilla. This is interesting because they provide new lore for Godzilla entirely, saying that, you know, he's a dinosaur that was still alive on one of the islands fought during World War II, and that this island was being experimented on with bombs, and that's where he was mutated from. So they go back in time to destroy Godzilla before he mutates into Godzilla. But in place of Godzilla, they place 3 door bats. At least I think that's what they were called. Now, door bats are like house pets of the future, right? But they intentionally do this so that whenever the bomb drops, they can create King Ghidorah. Now, King Ghidorah is their own monster that they bring forth into the 20th century so that they can destroy everything except for Tokyo. Now, the real reason why Japan was destroyed in the future is due to political corruption, and they want to destroy all of Japan except for Tokyo so that they can implement their futuristic politics onto that city and rebuild Japan with a new light. It gets fucking crazy, I know, but I goddamn love it. Now that they've taken out Godzilla, they need someone to take out King Ghidorah. And Godzilla's the only one who could take out King Ghidorah. So, under some weird fucking plot convenience, I don't remember what it is, they create an entirely new Godzilla in present time. So, they go at it, they fight, they fuck each other up, and Godzilla defeats King Ghidorah. Hell yeah. But, oh shit, Godzilla defeated King Ghidorah, and now Godzilla's on the loose. What the fuck do we do? So, one of the 3 time travelers is pro-modern day Japan, and she breaks off from the other 2 who want to destroy Japan to help Japan against these time travelers. She goes forward in time to get technology that isn't available to the Japanese yet, and then she uses that to create what is officially known to be motherfucking Mecha King Ghidorah. I don't know about you, but that's fucking kitty's titties right there. The difference here is that she's able to control King Ghidorah through the metal head. So, you know, you got all this shit. You got political conflict, you got time traveling, and you got monsters blowing shit up. I don't know what the fuck you could ask for next. So that movie is an absolute slam jam. If you want to get into Godzilla and its weirdness as a series, you gotta go after that one. There's no way to avoid it. It's a fucking monster bash. Following that movie up is Godzilla vs. Mothra. Now, Mothra is another classical monster, typically known to be the protagonist of the Godzilla franchise. So it made sense that if they're gonna bring back King Ghidorah, we gotta bring back Mothra too, right? And I gotta admit, while this film has a pretty fantastic final duel between Mothra, Godzilla, and a new enemy, Batra, it's so fucking boring. It takes so long to actually build up to this final fight that by the time it comes around, I don't even fucking care. Now, to this movie's credit, it does introduce a lot of new, interesting things. The twin fairies from the original Godzilla vs. Mothra, the 4th Godzilla film that I cited to introduce the fantasy element that would set stone the first 3 rules of Godzilla. It's explained in this one that they're actually called the Cosmos, and they represent the good and bad. So whenever Mothra is distressed or something like that, there is an alternative Mothra that's created called Batra, and he's said to represent the chaos of the universe or some... I don't fucking remember. But I will say, Batra is a cool enemy working alongside off of Mothra. It's important to make the distinction of working alongside because we're going to explore that later whenever we talk about Mechagodzilla. Now, with all that said, it's a pretty good layout for what should be a good Godzilla movie, but the main characters are very boring. There's not enough of a balance of the human conflict and the kaijus fighting. Like I said, the final fight is pretty iconic and it's pretty wonderful. But it's a slow film, it doesn't have a lot to it, and overall, if you're gonna watch it, I just say skip to the end. Now, because they're on a goddamn streak of introducing classic Godzilla villain after classic Godzilla villain, of course they had to bring back Mechagodzilla, but this is when things get interesting. Heisei period did something that none of the other eras of Godzilla has done. They've introduced consequences to these movies. In Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, modern-day Japanese people take the traces of Mecha King Ghidorah's metal head and they use that to construct Mechagodzilla. Mechagodzilla is the human's last resort to finally fight off Godzilla, you know, to destroy him and to stop all the chaos that he's brought forth during the series. Now, on one hand, I can empathize with people not caring for the new design of Mechagodzilla. I think the Showa and Millennium period do the title justice at making him look fucking cool. But at the same time, I don't really mind because I really enjoy the human characters in this film. I really enjoy how much they balance out Godzilla and Mechagodzilla fighting, you know, destruction alongside the human conflict. This film is probably my second or third favorite from this era. This is probably the one that balances out Godzilla's chaos with the humans' conflicts the best. The thing you gotta understand about these Godzilla flicks is that these two elements are essential to making each other work. You have to have Godzilla's chaos to create stakes for the characters, but likewise, it can't just be Godzilla's chaotic nature, or else the novelty of Godzilla destroying shit is lost. That's what makes the Heisei period films so masterful in their design. They're able to balance these two out. And this film is a pitch-perfect example of doing that. You get plenty of scenes of Godzilla wrecking shit, but it makes sure that it doesn't show too much to where it's boring. It makes sure it shows enough until you want to know what the humans are doing in reaction to Godzilla destroying shit. You got all sorts of different plots in this one. Godzilla's son, he exists in this movie. Godzilla lays an egg. Humans discover this egg, they abduct it, and they take it for research. This causes Godzilla to go absolutely batshit fucking crazy looking for his son. While this is happening, humans are also constructing Mechagodzilla to fight Godzilla, but they also discover that there's actually a second brain within his spine. So Godzilla has two brains, you know, all sorts of nervous system anatomy shit, and they figure in order to best fight Godzilla, they have to handicap Godzilla. I don't know, it's just a very interesting plot setup, and it makes for a very enjoyable third act of the film, the final fight. I really like this movie, and I widely recommend it if you're looking into Godzilla and if you enjoy the Heisei films up to this point. Now, following this up, I guess they decided it was time for a new villain, but they didn't really have any ideas that really clicked in their head, so they decided, let's make Godzilla with crystals. Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla is widely regarded to be the weakest entry in the Heisei period, and that might be true compared to its competitors, but even though this film isn't critically regarded to be amongst the best by any means, I still think it's one of the more enjoyable Godzilla films. Once again, I feel like they, for the most part, are able to balance out the human conflict for the kaiju fights. And even though the kaijus do fight in one general location throughout the final fight, Space Godzilla is actually a very interesting new villain. Now, it is basically just Godzilla with crystals, but they do a lot of neat, newer things with his design. They kind of up the antes a little bit, just newer, small things, and I just like it personally. I think Space Godzilla is a very good opponent, and I can kind of see what they're going for. They want Godzilla to fight himself, so their explanation was that whenever Mothra fought Godzilla in Godzilla vs. Mothra, she went up into space and carried DNA cells with her. There is another explanation over how when Biollante died, his cells shot up into space or some shit, but if we're going by the rules of this universe, technically, whenever Godzilla was erased in the past from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, Biollante shouldn't have even fucking existed since they merged cells. But whatever. Who gives a shit? From that point, the cells went into a black hole and came out a white hole, went through a little wormhole there, and I guess it created Space Godzilla or some shit. The thing that really entices me, which sadly isn't explored very further into the film, is what they go with as, like, their whole gimmick of this movie. So in Biollante, they mess around with fusing Godzilla's cells with other living organisms. In King Ghidorah, they fuck around with, you know, time travel. In Mechagodzilla, they fuck around with there being two brains within Godzilla, you know, just constantly building up the lore. So now you're wondering, where the hell could they possibly go at this point? Oh, isn't it easy? Fucking telepathy and telekinesis. Yup, they introduced those two elements into this film, and it is fucking beautiful. Listen, your long-running franchise isn't complete until there is some telekinesis-ass bitch to rebuild the connection between Godzilla movies and Friday the 13th, but Part 7. They had fucking telekinesis in that film, and it was kitty titty. The whole explanation behind it is that they want to find alternative means rather than destroying Godzilla, so they try to control his mind with telepathy and talk to him. It doesn't really go anywhere in the movie itself, which is kind of a shame because it's such a badass premise, but it still is a pretty good film, and despite people not really regarding it as a very good Godzilla movie, I had enjoyment out of it. I recommend this one. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a good entry into the Heisei period. Finally, to end off the Heisei period, we have what was considered to be by most for a few years the definitive death of Godzilla. Now, this was huge. This was a big deal back then. People didn't realize Godzilla was going to be coming back so soon. They thought he was actually going to die. And they made sure. They were extra careful to make sure that this film was a blast. Godzilla vs. Destoroyah is fan-fucking-tastic. It is an essential film to Godzilla's entire lineup thus far. And if you're going to watch the Heisei period, you better fucking watch this movie. So who is Destoroyah, you may ask? Well, Destoroyah is the final villain that Godzilla faces in this stage. Its origins are explained that whenever the Oxygen Destroyer, the device that killed Godzilla in the first movie, was released into the ocean, the Oxygen Destroyer somehow mutilated prehistoric parasites of some sort, and thus it created this giant fucking beast that has abnormally evolved into Destoroyah. Now you might be asking, Exro, why are you saying Destroyer like that? Oh, no, it's because it's not Destroyah. It's Destroyah. Yeah, his actual canonical name is Destoroyah, not Destroyer, so just don't get that mixed up. On top of this being a very suitable final villain for him to face because he faced the Oxygen Destroyer in the first movie, Godzilla himself is experiencing a nuclear meltdown, and it creates one of the coolest looking costumes in the Godzilla franchise. They say that his body is built like a nuclear power plant and that he's about to explode, essentially, from a meltdown. Now, if he explodes, not only will the Earth blow up, it'll set a dent in the fucking universe. They make sure that Godzilla's annihilation is also the annihilation of the Earth. So we got 3 different things going on here. Godzilla's gonna blow up and destroy all of existence. There's a new monster called Destoroyah, and now the Japanese have to find out how to make a new device to, you know, freeze Godzilla and put him in a cryostasis-like state. Well, shit, this sounds like a pretty damn good movie to me, and yeah, it's one of the best. This isn't my favorite Godzilla film, but they pulled off Godzilla's death masterfully. What's even more interesting is that by the end of the film, Godzilla doesn't even defeat Destoroyah. No, it's actually the military that has to defeat Destoroyah. At least I think that's how it went. I don't quite remember. And eventually, the Japanese are able to actually freeze Godzilla into a cryostasis, in which, during that cryostasis, he actually melts and he does die. In the wake of his death, he does leave his son that was previously established in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, who by this point pretty much looks like a smaller Godzilla. So it's set up for another franchise for whenever they want to bring back Godzilla, if they ever want to bring back Godzilla, which they do. They will eventually, but we'll talk about that probably in another video. But even with all of that, the actual death of Godzilla is fucking sad. You have to think about it like this. Whenever you've experienced Godzilla throughout this many hours and you've sunk in this much time into getting invested into the world of Godzilla, to see him die, it's depressing, it's sad, it's somber. You know, it makes you feel a little tug in your heartstrings. And it's played pretty sad too. It's not played as like this epic thing, this big finale to an ongoing journey. It's played like this is the end. Godzilla ain't gonna fucking come back. He's dead. A wonderful way to end off the greatness that was the Heisei period, and I'm probably gonna have to make 3 parts of this. How long has this recording session been so far? Oh, 40 minutes, you know, not too long. I could probably go on about this. I'm gonna cut off the video here. I'm gonna split this into 3 different parts, each one talking about a different series. All I have to say is that I can go on about this shit for hours. But regardless, thank you anyways for tuning in and hearing me ramble about this franchise that means so much to me. I hope if you ever wanted to look into Godzilla, now you know at least a decent place to start. Good night, gay flight, and have a beautiful time over at the Expose Motel.